Hello and welcome to your go-to Detroit Pistons podcast, the Pistons Pulse, co-hosted by me, Bryce Simon of Motor City Hoops, a former D1 hooper and current teacher, husband, and father of three amazing kids.
And I'm Omari Sankofa II, Pistons beat writer for the Detroit Free Press.
And of course, we're always blessed to be joined by our producer, Wes Davenport. And before we introduce our amazing guest today, I do want to let everybody know we've been getting your reviews, we've been getting your ratings, we've been getting your comments, and we appreciate you guys so much. We're so close to 200 reviews on Apple, so get those in. Next week, it'll just be Omari and I, and we will get to all of those and kind of make up for some lost time here. We don't like to read those when we have guests, and especially today with this guest where we got to make the most of our time because he has so much information to give. It is not one of the Detroit Pistons historian from Bad Boys and Beyond. You guys should be checking that out every week as well. Keith Black Trudeau making his first appearance on the Pistons Pulse. We had him over on Motor City Hoops, but the first time on the Pistons Pulse. Keith, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. It's great to be here. I listen to you guys, and you guys cover my work commutes on like Mondays and Tuesdays every week. I do love this show.
Thank you.
Yeah, I was just saying before we turned the cameras on. I think it's the first time I've seen you in the flesh, Keith. I mean, we followed each other for 3-4 years, interacted a ton, but it's just nice to have the face-to-face finally.
Yeah. It's kind of weird. When I have my own podcast, it's like a lot of people that I have on as guests, we communicate with each other for years prior to that. And it's interesting. I hear the same thing. It's the first time that they say, even like Isaiah Thomas and Grant Hill, they're like, it's the first time I get to see your face. It is pretty interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and so you guys know, Keith has recently had Grant Hill, who we're going to talk about today, and Isaiah Thomas on their podcast over there. So you guys got to make sure you're checking out what him and Mike Payton are doing. But on today's episode, listen, I tried to bring Keith on to do the history of the Pistons, and it turned into like a 3-episode thing. So we're going to try to keep this as short as possible, but we're going to get into the details. We're going to talk Omari. We're going to talk Grant Hill. We're going to talk the formation of the Going to Work squad, talk about some of those guys, and try to keep it to an hour, a little bit more, just what we can do. So Keith, let's start with the aforementioned Grant Hill, and let's actually start towards the end of this. This is something, as somebody just recently joined the Pistons fan base, I don't fully understood or didn't fully understand what kind of happened with Grant Hill at the end that ended up him leaving town.
Here's kind of the interesting thing that I think, here's a misconception that people have, is that Grant Hill was as frustrated with the lack of success of the Pistons throughout his tenure there, and he was just looking for the first door. That's not actually what happened. That the Pistons during the mid-'90s were just a picture of how to mismanage a team with a budding young superstar. That's not in doubt. But Grant himself, I think, had the confidence that because he was Grant Hill, that things would eventually get turned around, and he just needed a little bit of help, and it wouldn't be that difficult. What I think ended it, well, in fact, I know what ended it was the mismanagement of his ankle injury. And he was having arguably the best season of his career, his last season with the Pistons, which is really saying something because he was so good prior to that. But what happened was he had suffered an ankle injury that was misdiagnosed, I think, as a sprain, and they said he'd be back for the playoffs. Actually, they brought him back a little bit before the playoffs, and then he was clearly too hurt to play, clearly in too much pain, and they told him he'd be back for the playoffs. But the bottom line is the doctors misdiagnosed the entire thing. He had a broken bone in his foot, but all they were giving him were MRIs, which is, of course, soft tissue. They weren't looking at the bone. They were looking at the tendons and the muscle. So they kept reactivating him, and he kept telling the team that, look, my foot still really hurts. I don't feel any better. And eventually, I think the lead doctor kind of put it out there that, sometimes athletes think that they're more injured than they are. And that really pissed him off. So he went and got, I think it was Arnie Kander, who was the team trainer. He wasn't even the doctor at the time. After, I think, game 1 of the Miami Heat, where he looked terrible, he got destroyed by Jamal Mashburn, who was not a quick guy, but he was going around Grant like Grant was a statue, because that's essentially what Grant was. He couldn't move. So long story short, Arnie Cantor takes him to get an X-ray, and as soon as he sees the X-ray, he immediately tells Grant, "Don't even put your foot on the floor. I'm getting you a wheelchair." Like, I think I don't know if we can swear on here, but I think Grant said the exact words out of Arnie Cantor's mouth were a variation of "Holy crap." It shocked him how badly, like Grant's entire ankle had caved in on his foot. Like it was horrifying. And at that point, that's the weird thing. Grant had every intention of sticking around and seeing it through, especially with the emergence of Jerry Stackhouse, because at that point the Pistons had a superstar and a very high-level number 2 guy. And everyone knows once you have those two, it's not that hard to find the rep to fill out the rest of the team, right? But at that point, I think he felt, and I think rightfully so betrayed by the organization that they didn't stand up for him when he told them that there was something really wrong with his foot. That at that point, I think he was ready to look at other options. And I don't think Joe Dumars. And also keep in mind, this was Joe's, as soon as that season ended, this was Joe's very first role as managing an NBA team, was to re-sign Grant Hill. That summer was when he officially took over. And what he essentially told Grant was, you go out and you look at other situations, and I'm going to go on a trip to Europe, and then when I come back, we'll talk. And it's just not. I think Grant really took it differently than how Joe meant it, because Grant didn't really feel like a priority. And when you're dealing with a guy that's one of the top 5 guys in the league at that point, that's really not. You want them to make them feel like they are your number 1 priority. And Grant really didn't take it that way. So, and he was the number 1 free agent at the time. Nobody really thought Tim Duncan was going to leave San Antonio except for Orlando. Tracy McGrady was on his way up, but he wasn't seen as being at Grant's level. So Grant was the one guy that had every team in the league with cap space lining up to pitch him offers. And Grant really didn't like any of the situations except for Orlando. And Orlando, to their credit, gave him a very strong pitch. They nearly landed Tim Duncan as well as he and Tracy McGrady. They almost had a super team before we realized super teams were a thing. But yeah, at that point, I think as soon as Grant visited Orlando, I think that's when he realized that, I don't even feel the need to talk to Joe anymore. This is a much better situation for me, and I'm gone.
I sat down with Grant Hill last summer after he came out with his autobiography, which is called Game Fair, if anybody wants to check it out. One thing he did talk about in his book was just the team construction side. Obviously, the team lost Allen Houston, I believe, to the Knicks, and he talked about how they mismanaged that situation. Just beyond the injuries with Grant Hill, just what were some of the mismanagement, maybe as far as you're a rebuilding team, you're trying to surround this guy with talent, and they just didn't do a good job of that?
Okay, so this is the funny thing. This is almost like an inverse of Cade Cunningham, where as soon as Cade Cunningham was picked, he was the number 1 guy. All of Detroit wanted him picked number 1. He was kind of anointed before he even played in Summer League. He was seen as, this is our savior. Grant really wasn't that. The number 1 prize in Grant's draft was actually Glenn Robinson from Purdue. He was the guy that everybody – look, I actually sat in the Pistons draft party at the Palace for the 94 draft. I was sitting next to Don Chaney, who was the coach. Like, everybody wanted Glenn Robinson. And when the Pistons landed 3rd, it was pretty clear that Robinson and Kidd were going to go 1 and 2, and Grant would probably go 3. It was that clear cut even at the time. So, the mood was, hey, we're going to get a good player, but, we missed out on the superstar. And then Grant Hill played his first game, and we all realized, holy crap, we've got something special. Like, that's the very first, 2 or 3 games, everybody in Detroit realized, oh, my God, we have the guy. This guy is special. And I think that was almost a curse, because immediately management, they tried to do something drastic every single year of Grant's career. It's not for lack of trying. It's that I think they tried to microwave a great team around Grant Hill, and it just never worked. I mean, I could go on not Grant's rookie year, getting Oliver Miller, which Omari referenced Grant's book. There's a story in there about Oliver Miller, who was the very first guy that took Grant out after he became a Piston, after everyone had warned him specifically to not go out with Oliver Miller. And it turned into a scene from The Hangover where they get stranded in Canada, and Oliver Miller is trying to show Grant that he can drive down I-75 without hands. and Grant is basically looking to escape with his life by the end of the night. So that Grant's rookie year goes very poorly. The team is not put together well, even though Grant's clearly the best rookie in the league. I'm sorry, Jason Kidd, he was. So they fire him, and they hire Doug Collins and essentially give him the Stan Van Gundy role, where they make him the coach and GM at the same time. And Collins, a highly intelligent guy, one of the best broadcasters you'll ever hear, but just couldn't relate to players very well. He had a game of musical chairs going in the backcourt with Dumars, Allen Houston, and Lindsey Hunter, where he had three guards that all wanted to start, only two of them could. And I think that kind of chased Allen Houston out of town, even though he was clearly an all-star in the making. And he didn't really want to play for Doug Collins anymore. No one on that team really wanted to play for him after they had played for him. So then that brings us to the summer of '96, which is still the worst offseason in team history, where Doug Collins lowballs an unrestricted free agent in Allen Houston, the top guard in the market, and Allen leaves and just never comes back because the Knicks threw the entire bag at him. And of course he leaves. I mean, you can't even blame him for that. That's just poor management. So Doug tries to overcompensate. He trades 2 first-rounders for Stacey Augmon and Grant Long just to fill the gaps. Augmon was a terrible fit. That team still somehow wins 54 games. But then he goes out the next summer and signs Brian Williams, now known as Bison Dele, to a huge free agent contract. Never mind the fact that everybody knew that Bison Dele he was the kind of guy that he got paid to play basketball, but he just didn't have the passion for it, the consistency. And it kind of took the team down a notch. And that gets Doug Collins fired. And then, 98, they trade for Jerry Stackhouse, and that's the one great move they made in the entire time that Grant was in Detroit. But Doug, it's not enough to save Collins' job. He gets fired. They miss the playoffs. We go to '99, the lockout season. Jerry Stackhouse, who is a young, thriving shooting guard, he needs minutes. He needs to start. But the problem is Joe Dumars is still on the team, and everybody knows that Dumars is going up into management. So the coach certainly isn't going to bench Joe Dumars, even though at this point in his career, he's basically just a spot-up shooter. He's not guarding anybody. He's not making plays. He's just a guy that spots up. He was still really good at it, but, Stack needed minutes. So, of course, Jerry Stackhouse wasn't happy, and that '99 season turns into a first-round exit where they get dispatched by a Hawks team that shouldn't have been on the court with them. Every single year there was something. They had one problem, tried to patch it, and another hole pops up in the boat. And then we get to 2000, and there's actually hope with Grant and Jerry, despite a mediocre season. And, we just went over that. The injuries happen, and then Grant leaves. It was just one thing after another. There was really no patience. It's kind of the opposite of now where fans, including myself, think the Pistons are showing a little too much patience, that they need to get brave and start making some moves. With Grant Hill, they made moves every year, and it wound up setting them back.
Let's talk about the move that actually ends up getting made, Keith. Orlando sign and trade, Grant Hill. What was the perception of that trade? And then we can kind of start moving into, did anybody know that Ben Wallace was the key centerpiece to this trade?
Okay, so you can look at this 2 ways. One, I think everybody in Piston land knew that Ben Wallace could play, simply because when he was in Washington, he killed the Pistons every time they played, even in a minor role. Like he made his presence noticeable on the court. He was the exact kind of center that you would dream about having with the Pistons when they had Grant Hill and Jerry Stackhouse, because he would have tied it all together. Nobody thought that he would be an all-star or a Hall of Famer. No, that's ridiculous. And even Joe, if anyone says that, they're lying. But it goes down as one of the best sign and trade deals ever. I think Orlando was really motivated to because again, the only team that could have offered to grant the 7-year max was Detroit. So the only way to get around that was to do a sign and trade. So I think it was that important to Orlando to give him that 7th-year max and essentially keep him in Orlando for the entirety of his prime, that they didn't really mind it when Joe asked for Ben Wallace and Chucky Atkins. It backfired horribly. But yeah, that wound up, like you said, that wound up being the foundation of a championship team that nobody saw coming.
When you look back at just how that team came into fruition, how much I mean, you identified talent, but how much was just, I don't want to say luck, but luck too. I mean, there's luck in any process, and for the team to gel maybe as quickly as it did was something that few people could predict back in 2001.
So there was an old theory going around among Piston fans that I kind of agree with, that Joe had a clairvoyance when it came to players that he played against, because all of his 90% of his best acquisitions were all guys that were still playing when he was in the league, and he was batting 1,000 pretty much on those guys whenever he brought them in. So I think he knew that Ben Wallace was better than how he was perceived, but it wasn't just Ben Wallace. Halfway through that next season, he gets Corliss Williamson for Jerome Williams, and Corliss Williamson had trouble finding a home. He was a guy that was a tweener, didn't have the 3-point range. People wondered, was he a 4 or a 3? He couldn't really guard either position. But he comes into Detroit and he thrives because they gave him a real opportunity, made him an offensive focal point. Beyond that, after that first year, they go and get Cliff Robinson in a salary dump from Phoenix. They essentially get him for nothing other than cap space. And Cliff Robinson, who was at 34 at that time, people kind of looked at him as, like you would any other 34, 35-year-old big man is. He's on the downside of his career. He comes to Detroit. He actually makes the all-defensive team his first year. Winds up being a perfect mentor next to Ben Wallace. It's just piece after piece of guys that Joe found from his playing days that were undervalued, and he brings them in. John Barry's another one. I don't think Damon Jones played when Joe was playing, but he was another gem that he found. Dana Barros came in and contributed a little bit before he retired. There's just guy after guy. And to put things in perspective, Sports Illustrated had the Pistons prior to 01-02. They had them picked 14th in the East, not the league, the East. They had them, I think, as one of the 2 or 3 worst teams in the NBA. That team went out and won 50 games. And, I also forgot to mention one more guy, Zeljko Rabracha, who was a guy that was drafted in the mid-90s. He was a 30-year-old when Joe brought him over as a rookie. Mehmet Okur, who Joe drafted in 2001 as a European drafted stash. People get mad at Joe over Darko, but Joe was batting 1,000 on European bigs prior to that. He had every reason to be a little overconfident in European big men because he found guys that way overperformed what people were expecting of them. But yeah, that 02 team, to this day, that team still has a special place in my heart, because that was the first time that it felt like, not like the Bad Boys, because it wasn't a championship team, clearly, but it had that championship metal to them, that vibe, that culture. And that team was bigger than the sum of their parts, and they fought their hearts out. They won 50 games, and they got out of the first round. They were the surprise team of the NBA that whole season. That's still a great team to me.
All right, we're going to go to a short break. When we come back, we're going to continue with this and look at the rest of the acquisitions that everybody knows, but we're going to talk about how they happened, how they were perceived, how those guys came to Detroit, and this all came together. Omari will ask Keith that, starting with Mr. Big Shot, Chauncey Billups, when we come back from this short break.
All right, we are back with segment 2, and we're going to dive right into Chauncey. I think a lot of people knew he was a journeyman before he arrived in Detroit, and sort of along the lines of Ben Wallace, right? The guy has talent, but you probably don't expect him to ascend to the extent that he did. Just what was the initial reaction to that trade for Chauncey Billups, and at what point did maybe his reputation begin to shift?
All right, well, that offseason of 2002, Joe And that's weird because the Pistons, I just got done talking about how awesomely successful they were, and they surpassed everybody's expectations. So everyone kind of thought, okay, we're going to keep this team together. We're going to maybe add a piece or two and move forward. Joe didn't see it that way. Joe saw a team that had maxed out and went to start, selling on guys while their value was high. And the first thing he did before that was well, that was after Chauncey, but I'm going to get to him later, where he traded Jerry Stackhouse, who was the team leader, who had gotten so much praise for being a playmaker instead of a scorer. He trades him for Rip Hamilton, which was seen as kind of one of those one step back to go two steps forward moves because he had a better contract. He was a younger player, but no one thought he was better than Jerry Stackhouse. Nobody. And then the other move he did was he goes after Chauncey Billups, who was, like you said, Omar, he was I think he was the third pick in the draft by Boston in '97. Rick Pitino gave up on him after half a season. He trades him to Toronto, and he gets injured from there. He bounces around 3 or 4 different teams. He finally gets an opportunity to play in Minnesota, where they sign him as a backup, and then the starter Terrell Brandon goes down, and he winds up reestablishing himself there and having a really great season. But the problem is Terrell Brandon is supposed to come back the next season, and the Timberwolves decide we're going to keep 30-something-year-old Terrell Brandon over Chauncey Billups, which was kind of head-scratching to me. But anyway, they kind of cut him loose. So Billups becomes like the top free agent point guard on the market, and you have 10 or 11 different teams lining up to give him the full mid-level, which I think at that time was like 5 years, 30-some million. And the only way that Joe could differentiate himself from every other team was to tell Chauncey, look, I'm not only going to give you the full mid-level, I'm giving you the keys to the car. This is a 50-win team. We're going to bring you in, and we're going to promise you the starting job. And we're going to go from there because that's how much I believe in you. And that worked. That convinced Chauncey to sign in Detroit over all of those other teams that wanted him. Just for the future, when people argue that Detroit can't land free agents, it's not always about market size. Sometimes it is, but sometimes it isn't. Sometimes it's about relationships and fit. And in this case, it was. And I want to say that the reception was lukewarm. Everybody knew how much Billups had meant to all the teams around the league during free agency. Everyone knew he was a coveted point guard. But in Detroit, we weren't even sure we wanted him. There was another guy by the name of Jeff McGinnis that wound up going to the Clippers. That was more of a pure point that everyone thought would be a better fit, whereas Chauncey was more of a combo guard. At least that's how he was seen. So we weren't really that sold on him, especially with the big contract that he got. And yeah, I think it kind of made things worse because no one remembers this, thankfully, but Chauncey had a lot of problems adjusting early on in Detroit. Chauncey, as promised, started every game, but Chucky Atkins was finishing them. Like, Chucky Atkins was clearly the better player between he and Billups for the first couple of months of the season. Like, Chauncey would start the game, but he would only play like half of it. And in the fourth quarter, Rick Carlisle would be playing Chucky Atkins and sometimes John Barry in the fourth quarter over Rip and Chauncey because they didn't have enough experience playing in Rick's system, and they didn't have enough chemistry at that point. It took a lot of time. But if you look at, like, before New Year's, Chauncey was averaging like 10 points and 3 assists, and he was shooting not very well, but badly. But after New Year's, something clicked, and Chauncey was averaging 19 points. He was shooting well over 40% from 3. He had several memorable games. He just destroyed the Lakers one game. He had a game winner against Golden State. He had a game winner against Chicago. He had a game winner against Atlanta. He had all of these game winners in a very short amount of time, and that's how he got the name Mr. Big Shot. Yeah, like, he was long before he even played a playoff game. And of course, from that point on, we remember the 3-1 comeback in Orlando against Orlando in the playoffs. Billups had 40 in Game 6, and he had 37 more in Game 7. And then he eliminates the Sixers playing on a very badly sprained ankle in an overtime Game 6 to get them to the conference finals. And I think at that point, everyone in Detroit was locked in with, okay, this is our franchise point guard. This is the guy we're going to eventually win with.
Was Rip showing that same level of this is our franchise two guard? I mean, you touched on him a little bit. And so how was that perceived? And could you start to see, you know, you talked about how Chauncey progressed throughout that year. Did Rip do the same thing? Could you see this is the backcourt of a potential NBA championship, or was it more Chauncey and Rip was still kind of finding his way?
It was more Chauncey, to be honest with you. Rip he didn't have the lows that Chauncey did, but he also didn't have the highs. He was a very consistent mid-range guy, getting 18 to 25 points just about every night. But he wasn't doing anything else necessarily. He wasn't seen as a great defender. Wasn't seen as a guy that was a great playmaker. He was a guy that was coming off of screen. That's kind of by design. That's how Rick Carlisle saw him. So it was kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy where they just wanted a guy that would shoot an efficient 18 points a game, and that's kind of what they got from him. I don't think Rip really started taking off until Larry Brown became the coach, and ultimately Flip Saunders, I think, made him his best version of himself.
So Rip comes in, Chauncey comes in, of course, two core guys. Tayshaun, I believe he was a 4-year player at Kentucky, known for his defense coming in. I was really young in those years, but what was the perception of Tayshaun before he had that playoff series where it became known like, okay, like he's a true glue guy. We need his defense. We need his shooting.
Yeah, Tayshaun, it's kind of interesting. He wasn't really seen as an elite college player, but he was like one of the first college players to go viral. He had this really crazy start to a game. I want to say it was against North Carolina. I'm not 100% sure, but it was while he was with Kentucky. And he winds up scoring like their first 17, 18 points of the game, like hitting 6 threes in a row. And it was the first like internet viral video of a college player just going nuts. So that's really the only thing that everybody knew about him. Even though he went to Kentucky, Kentucky wasn't great at that time. They were just okay. So it's not like they were in the Final Four. But I'll credit this to Joe. The Pistons had drafted a small forward the year before by the name of Rodney White. Top 10 pick. He was a one and done out of UNC Charlotte. He was seen as the guy, as like the first like big future talent. Like you draft him, you develop him. He was very young. I think he was only 19 at the time. And after a year, Joe already had seen enough. He had seen enough to where he was ready to draft someone with more experience because the team was ahead of schedule. He needed a guy that could play now. So he goes out and Tayshaun drops to the, like you said, the 20-something pick in the draft. And Tayshaun immediately, I remember Summer League. Like it wasn't on TV, but you could see you heard the reports, the box scores. Like Tayshaun was clearly outplaying Rodney White in Summer League. And before the season starts, Joe ships off Rodney White and essentially gives Tayshaun, he anoints Tayshaun as that new future piece. And I think we all saw that in preseason, like he could play. But the problem is Rick Carlisle didn't see it that way. This is one of the weirdest. All right, fans have a tendency to want the rookie to play even when he's not ready. Like this is like the only instance in the history of the Detroit Pistons where the fans were right and the coach was wrong. Tayshaun, all right, let's add some context. There's a guy by the name of Michael Curry, who was a journeyman. I think his career is a great story, how many countries he had to play in before he even got his shot in the NBA. All of that's fine and dandy, but he was also nicknamed by Piston fans the binary man because all his stat line after every game would be ones and zeros. He was a very competent defender, but that was essentially it. He wasn't a very good outside shooter, wasn't a playmaker, wasn't a rebounder, wasn't really anything other than an intelligent, connected defender, which is valuable, but that's not the guy you want starting on a playoff team. And the fans were just screaming bloody murder that Tayshaun would never get a chance. And Carlisle eventually gives Tayshaun a chance, but he like sets him up to fail because it's on a road trip, like a 3-4 against 4 playoff teams. He doesn't look very good. And then Carlisle uses that as an excuse to pull him. And he really doesn't play that entire season until the Orlando playoff series. After the Pistons go down, famously, they go down 3-1 to an 8 seed. and their season is on the verge of collapse. And at that point, Rick Carlisle, he finally sees some light, and he says, all right, we're just going to throw the kitchen sink at Tracy McGrady, because he was the one killing him by himself. So starting at Game 5, he starts giving Tayshaun rotation minutes guarding Tracy McGrady. And his length is actually bothering McGrady. It's disrupting him to the point where by Game 7, he's playing a significant role. He's actually scored. I think he has a double-figure scoring night as a rookie in a Game 7 during a season he barely even played. And then that continues on to the Philly series, where he's actually the hero at the end of, I think it was Game 2, where he hits the tying shot to send it to overtime, and then he dominates overtime. It's one of the most ridiculous stories. I can't remember how many times in NBA history a rookie has not played during the season basically at all, and then has played more minutes in the playoffs than he did during the season, and looked extremely confident in those minutes. It's just a weird situation. But that was Detroit's. That was really the NBA's introduction to Tayshaun Prince, was that 2003 playoff.
So could you? We like to talk about cores, right, Keith? Especially this current iteration of the Pistons.
Right.
Did the Pistons feel like after that playoffs there was this true core of Chauncey, Rip, Tayshaun, and Ben? Like, what is that? What the vibe was, and was as this leads into, as we know, the final acquisition. Did people feel like that was enough? Did they feel like they had the surrounding pieces? Was there something lost in that offseason that then what made Rasheed necessary? And let's just kind of lead into that. But what was the vibe around kind of those four guys?
One player away. I think that was the consensus by most fans when they got swept by New Jersey, which wasn't as bad as it looked, because Chauncey he was not recovered from that sprained ankle he had suffered against Philadelphia. It was one of those things where, yeah, they got embarrassed, but they also, a lot of fans came out of that happy, because during that series they won the number 2 pick in the draft via Memphis. So it was weird getting swept and being happy about it, but everyone was just so looking forward to next season. And the one thing that the team really lacked, they had Ben Wallace, of course, but it was kind of Ben Wallace on an island. They needed a second big man to play with Ben Wallace. And that's, I think, a lot of the reason that came behind the Pistons being so set on Darko Milicic, because they felt they had found their small forward in Tayshaun. They didn't need to look at Carmelo Anthony, but they needed a second big next to Ben Wallace. And I think it was clear to the Pistons very early on that Darko was not that guy, and they had made a mistake. I think they held out hope, but it was very clear Darko's rookie season where I think behind closed doors, they lost faith in him quickly. And so, and this is the other great thing that Joe did. Joe didn't do what Doug Collins did. He didn't make a panic move. He patiently waited. He knew he had 2 first-round picks in the next draft that he could use as bait. He had a bunch of expiring contracts that he could use as bait. And Rasheed Wallace was being talked about actually since the beginning of the season, because he wasn't happy in Portland, and Portland was getting ready to rebuild. So he was an obvious trade candidate. And not a whole lot of other teams had the ammo to go and get him, because they didn't have the picks. They didn't have the expiring contracts. It was really the Pistons and a couple other teams. And what kind of dealt everybody a bit of a blow was when Portland trades Rasheed Wallace to Atlanta for Theo Ratliff and Sharif Abdul-Rahim. So everyone thought the door was maybe closed on that. But there was no reason for the Hawks to keep him either, because they were a terrible team, and Rasheed was at the end of his contract. Like, he probably wasn't going to resign there. So we're up to trade deadline day, and the name Rasheed Wallace is still being floated around as a possibility. But I know all the beat writers at the time, I want to say Chris McCoskey especially, were telling everybody, look, this is probably not going to get done. You're probably going to get a conservative, cap clearing move, or maybe a second round or something that's not really consequential. And then out of nowhere, it kind of hits maybe an hour before the deadline that the Pistons do land Rasheed Wallace. That they send the 2 first-round picks. They send Lindsey Hunter and some role players away for Rasheed Wallace. It's one of the best trades in Piston history. It might be the best trade in Piston history, mid-season anyway. It might be the best mid-season trade in NBA history, to be honest, because if you look at the history of mid-season deals, those do not result in championships, not the big ones. This one was just it microwaved a great team overnight. It's really hard to put into words how exciting that was, because you could see the fit talent-wise, how he would fit in perfectly, as long as the chemistry was there, and thank God it was.
Absolutely. Let's talk about, so you get a little bit deeper, right? Let's talk about the block and what that was like, right? Like just this historic moment, just getting into that playoff run as a whole. I know that people expected them to make a deep playoff run just based on the previous season, but how strong were those hopes, right? Like how realistic at the time did it appear that the Pistons could go that far? Because obviously the Lakers were stacked, but just what was the general vibe around the team as far as if they could actually get it done?
All right, so the vibe prior to the Rasheed trade is that it would be a repeat of the previous 2 years, where the Pistons would make the playoffs. They'd probably win a series or two, and then they would meet a superior team and they would get dumped. And that superior team that season was the Indiana Pacers. They had crushed the Pistons 3 times already prior to that deal. They had the best record in the league. They were clearly the class, I think, of the entire league. They were outplaying everybody, including the Lakers. And everyone was just waiting for the Lakers to turn it on in the playoffs, right? But once that Rasheed trade happened, the Pistons were just clearly far and away even better than the Pacers. Just to give you some numbers going into that postseason, they had 21 games with Rasheed starting. They only lost 4 of them, and 2 were at the buzzer. Their point differential of 13.3 was the exact same one as the 96 Bulls. Granted, this is a quarter of the season versus a full season. I'm just giving you I'm giving you the scope of how dominant they were that last quarter of the season. They held 8 teams under 70 points. 5 teams in a row they held under 70. The second most of all time is 2. And yeah, it was utter domination. So unfortunately, Rasheed Wallace suffered a plantar fascia issue that kind of made the Pistons defense mortal in the playoffs. But going on, they were still, like, defensively, they were crushing people. They crushed the Bucks in the first round. They go to New Jersey. They nearly lose the series. They have to gut that one out against a very good New Jersey team, but they do it, and they crush them in Game 7. And then, like you said, the block, the conference finals against their rivals from Indiana. I think those were, whoever won that series, I think was going to win the championship. And we talk about the block, but there was like 20 blocks in that game before that the Pistons had made. It's the greatest combined block shot game of all time, I believe. I think the Pistons total is the second or third most of all time in that game. It was the best defensive game I've ever seen in my life. People talk about the scores like in the 60s. Yeah, but I think any team in the league would have problems scoring in that game. That was just awesome. But yeah, we talk about the block, but I think Rasheed Wallace's guarantee was very, very important because it gave them the rest of the team the confidence to back him up that game. And even though nobody shot well at all, the effort displayed, I think, reflected the intensity and the belief that they had that they were the better team and they could win a championship. To be honest with you, I think the finals against the Lakers was the easiest series they had because the Lakers were the only team that did not take them seriously. And by the time the Lakers knew what was happening, it was already over. The Pistons had already clamped them down.
All right, one final question here, Keith, before we go to another break. We've talked about the mainstays, right? And you may have answered this a little bit, but what is or who is the unheralded move or player? Like, obviously that 5, the greatest 5 ever assembled, the chemistry was crazy, but is there a guy off the bench? Maybe it was a specific move. What is something you would point to that you feel like maybe is a little underrated that kind of put that all together or helped keep the glue together? Is there something that maybe it's just something that's not talked enough about, Keith, that you would like to point out here before we move on to some other stuff? So
you're saying of the 04 team, like an unsung hero? Okay,
yeah.
I would say Lindsey Hunter. A lot of people are going to say Mike James because he came to Detroit with Rasheed in the trade, and he was great during the regular season. He and Lindsey Hunter, who they traded, by the way, they traded Lindsey Hunter, and Lindsey Hunter was waived as part of the handshake agreement, and he came back to sign with the Pistons, which would not be allowed today. But fans called them the pit bulls because when Larry Brown executed his full court press, and you have not seen a full court press in the NBA until you've seen the 04 Pistons do it. It's almost like a college team where they made other teams look like amateurs. Like if you didn't have an all-star caliber point guard, you were going to turn the ball over 15 times and a half if Larry Brown wanted to really crush you. So Mike James didn't play as much in the playoffs because, as I said, Rasheed Wallace's foot injury hurt his ability to move, to run the floor. So they couldn't really do the press in the playoffs. But Lindsey Hunter remained a big part of the rotation. He was guarding Jason Kidd a lot of the times in the playoffs. He was guarding Gary Payton. He was guarding the other team's best ball handler in just about every series whenever Chauncey had to check out. Lindsey Hunter in general, I think his career as a Piston is very underrated. But in that 04 team, it's hard to say that they don't win the championship without him, but he certainly made it easier.
I love it. All right, we do have to go to a short break. When we come back, I had a listener reach out with very specific question. Couple guys a little further back he wanted you to talk about. And then, of course, Keith Black Trudeau is a current Piston fan and analyst and has some thoughts. So we'll dive into a little bit of the current roster as well. Omari will lead us off right after this short break.
All right, we are back with segment 3, and we're going to get into a question we had from one of our listeners and then get into the current state of the team as well. So Rick Cologne, I hope I pronounced that correctly, was curious about Dave Bing and Dave DeBusschere. I think the average Pistons fan is probably more familiar with Dave Bing. Just, of course, he's had a presence in the city on the business side, former mayor, and probably played a little bit more recently as well. But just what are your recollections of those two players?
I think fans might remember Dave Bing as the original Killian Hayes hater. Right, so Dave Bing and Dave DeBusschere, they're kind of their stories are actually kind of intertwined in a way. So I could probably talk about both of them at once. Dave DeBusschere was the original. All right, we had this thing called the territorial draft back then. I don't know if you guys are familiar with it. All right, so prior to, I want to say 1966, the NBA had a rule where anybody, any amateur player, any college player that was local to your franchise within a certain radius, you could forfeit your first round pick and simply claim their rights. And the Pistons used it twice. The very first time that they used it was on. Let me step back for a second. Wilt Chamberlain was a territorial pick from Kansas.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting.
You didn't know? Okay. So, yeah, just a quick anecdote. Wilt Chamberlain went to Kansas, but the Philadelphia Warriors claimed him.
I was going to say, how's that in their territory?
Because they claimed, and they were awarded that, they claimed because he grew up in Philadelphia, went to high school in Philadelphia, that he was still local to them. Of course, the NBA did away with the territorial draft in the mid-'60s because there was this guy named Lou Alcindor, later known as Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, who grew up in New York and then went to school at UCLA. So who gets his rights? Is it the Knicks or the Lakers? So the NBA decided to do away with it at that point because they didn't want to get taken to court. All right. So anyway, Dave DeBusschere, Detroit legend, one of the 5 best, in my estimation, one of the 5 best players ever out of the city of Detroit. Detroit high school legend, goes to University of Detroit, is a star there. Just an excellent, excellent player. And the Pistons take him as the 1962 territorial draft pick. He's not an all-star his first couple of seasons, but he's clearly really, really good. The problem is in the 1960s, the Pistons were run way worse than the Pistons have ever been run in any of our lifetimes. It was that bad. So to give you some context, prior to Dave DeBusschere's 3rd season, and by the way, Dave DeBusschere was also a pitcher for the Chicago White Sox. So he was doing that in his offseason instead of working on his game. He was just a couple of years, but the point is he was a 2-sport athlete. So what happens, Charlie Wolf, who was the coach at that point, going into DeBusschere's 3rd season, they fire him early on in that season. Fred Zollner, the owner, does. And he was the coach and GM, so now he has 2 vacant spots. So instead of doing a search, it's mid-season. He can't really afford to do one. So he hires Don Watrick, who is the WXYT sports director and also the broadcaster. He was with no real experience prior. They basically hired George Blaha to run the team. So, and what Wattrick's first move is to go into instead of, again, we have a season, so he can't really do a big search. So he goes to the Pistons locker room and offers Dave DeBusschere the head coaching job if he would quit baseball. So their 24-year-old, not even an all-star yet, power forward, is now also the head coach, which, yeah, I think he's still the youngest head coach ever in pro sports, I think, to this day. It was just a calamity. And in the 1960s, you only had like 4 or 5 teams, I think 5 or 6 teams per conference. And the Pistons missed the playoffs all 3 years that DeBusschere was the head coach. It's not his fault either. He was an all-star. It's just it was way too much on the plate of a guy in his mid-20s, right? So DeBusschere's third season, and this is how we'll transition to Dave Bing.
I looked and you were correct. He used 24. There was also a Major League Baseball for the Indians that was also 24. So depending on birthdays and stuff like that, that holds true with the age.
Thanks. All right. So 1966 draft. We didn't have a lottery back then, but it wasn't by record either. How it went was we had a coin flip between the 2 worst teams every year to make sure that there was it was even anti-tanking back in the 60s. So we had a coin flip between the 2 worst teams, and we had this major college star. The biggest star in college coming out for the draft was a guy by the name of Cassie Russell, who went for the University of Michigan. So that was who everybody wanted, of course. And ironically, the Pistons would have used their territorial pick, but that was the year that the NBA decided we're going to do away with the territorial pick. So it came down to a coin flip between them and the Knicks. And, of course, they lose the coin flip, and everybody locally is crushed. They have to settle for the second pick, who turns out to be this kid out of Syracuse, by the way, of D.C., called Dave Bing, that no one really had ever heard of because, you weren't seeing Syracuse games on TV in the 1960s. So according to Jerry Green, who worked at the Detroit News, he was covering the Pistons at the time. I think the first question that Dave Bing got asked once he got to Detroit was, what's it like to not be wanted? The very first question, because everyone had Cassie Russell remorse. And it turns out that Dave Bing was way better than Cassie Russell. Not that Cassie was bad. He had a good career, but Dave Bing, one of the best, one of the top 75 players of all time. And look, I'm trying not to speak out of turn here. I'm just going on, the handful of games that I've seen of Dave Bing playing in Detroit in his prime, and also, reports that I've read from people covering Dave Bing, and they all say the same thing that my eyes have told me. Dave Bing, if I had to compare him to a modern player, it would be Derrick Rose. Dave Bing was the first, and Oscar Robertson was more of a big athlete than a quick guy. He didn't beat you with quickness as much as his size. I want to say Dave Bing was the very first point guard in the NBA to be clearly the best raw athlete on the floor and just beat people with athleticism. He would get in the air sometimes. I don't even know he knew what he was going to do. He would simply create offense simply by being quicker, stronger, and jumping higher than everybody else. It drove his coaches nuts. He had coach after coach, year after year, that tried to rein him in a little bit and tried to get him to be more of a pure point guard, but he just wasn't. He loved to. His way of playing basketball was kind of the herky-jerky, style we see from guys like Russell Westbrook today, where he would attack and then figure out what to do once he got to the rim. And so, how he and DeBusschere mesh, their last season together. DeBusschere is finally relieved of his head coaching duties, thankfully for him, because he and Dave Bing, who's going into his second season, he was Rookie of the Year the season before, they improve. They improve a lot as a duo. And the Pistons make it to the playoffs. And in the first round, they see Bill Russell's Celtics. And they actually win 2 of the first 3 games. Dave Bing is just killing the Celtics backcourt. But, of course, the Celtics come back and they win the next 3. They win the series 4-2 because Bill Russell puts his foot down. And the unfortunate lesson that ownership takes away from that is that we need a center. to play against Bill Russell. It's not that we competed. It's that, they have a center and we don't. So they decide to make the very bad idea, or they had the very bad idea to go out and trade Dave DeBusschere to the Knicks for Walt Bellamy. Walt Bellamy, if you look at his stats, they're unbelievable, but he was the very first, I don't want to say stat stuffer, but he was the type of guy that put up great numbers, and he was on his fourth team in 7 years. They called him the Undertaker because he would bury the teams that he played for. That sounds harsh because he's in the Hall of Fame primarily because of his numbers. I'm just saying that's how he was perceived. And it all played out that way. I just talked about Rasheed Wallace, the impact that he had for the Pistons. Dave DeBusschere was exactly that guy for the New York Knicks. Dave DeBusschere, and I haven't gotten into his game. I should have. 6'6" power forward, a little short even for that time, but he was strong as an ox. Very good outside shooter. Hell of a defender, 8-time all defense. He could guard 3-4 positions. Excellent pat. He was basically, I would compare him to Draymond Green with a jump shot. He was that kind of glue guy where he would do everything for you as long as you didn't ask him to be a number one scorer. So he goes to the Knicks and he takes them from good to great. They're in the conference finals that year, and then the next year they have the best record in the league. They win a championship, and Willis Reed, their center, gets hurt. Their MVP gets hurt in the 1970 finals. So they have to go 3 games with him not playing really 2 of them, or 2.5. And who do you think is guarding Wilt Chamberlain in that series? It's Dave DeBusschere, all 6'5", 6'6" Dave DeBusschere guarding Wilt freaking Chamberlain. And he does a credible job guarding him. He was just an excellent. I wish he was appreciated more in Detroit. It's almost like sacrilegious that he got traded because being a local product, being a Detroit guy, being an excellent basketball player, it's just bad management. And so Dave Bing is left, and they bottom out, of course, with Walt Bellamy and without DeBusschere. And then they land the number 1 pick, and they get Bob Lanier. So you would think that, look, that's when people think of the Pistons in the 70s, you think of Bing and Lanier, the Hall of Fame point guard and the Hall of Fame center. And you wonder why they didn't win more. It's because they were never healthy together. All right, so Dave Bing had an accident as a child where he had, a nail stuck into his eye, and he was saved. But he had some issues with it. And I want to say in the 71 season, which would have been Lanier's second season, he got scratched in that same eye. And it debilitated him for the rest of his career. And he had problems. Of course, he could still move, but he really couldn't shoot. He didn't have the depth perception. His outside shot really struggled. And teams knew he couldn't shoot from the outside, so they played him for the drive. And he wasn't nearly as effective as he was before. Before, he was an MVP caliber point guard. I want to stress that. He was every bit. He was seen as being every bit like the offensive threat, like Derrick Rose was. He was that. He was seen as that dominant of a guard. And that's kind of how it ends for Dave Bing in Detroit. The Pistons get sold by Fred Zollner to Bill Davidson in 1974. And Bing had this handshake agreement with Fred Zollner because he had some deferred money on his contract, but it wasn't in writing. So the Pistons had owed him some back pay. And when Davidson took over, he thought that he wasn't obligated to honor that. So, Dave Bing immediately says, I'm not going to play for you. I want to get traded. So they trade him to the Bullets. And that's kind of the end of Dave Bing's tenure in Detroit. Bing and DeBusschere are both members of the top 75 all-time team. They're both Hall of Famers, both seen in very, very high regard in NBA circles. It's just kind of sad that era of Pistons history is kind of forgotten about or dismissed because the Pistons were horribly mismanaged and they didn't have any team success.
All right, before we get out of here, Keith, let's talk about the current iteration of the Pistons. You talked a little bit earlier that, maybe this team is a little too patient, compared to what the teams were doing back then. But I think overall, we've talked about it. We talk all the time. We text about the team and moves. I think you're still I don't want to speak for you, but I feel like you're in a decent place. Where are you at right now with the restoration, this team, the acquisition of Ausar Thompson, even this offseason a little bit where I know a lot of fans were very frustrated with said patience?
Okay, I'm of two minds on this. One, I think it's okay that Troy Weaver didn't make a splash because he's made it clear that's not how he plans to build the team. He plans to build it through the draft. Troy Weaver has had 7, 8 first-round draft picks in 4 years. So that's been his chosen method to improve the team, and that makes sense. He cut his teeth as a scout, but we're getting into his 4th season, and I think it's time to see results. I don't think you can have longer than a 4-year rebuild and then tell me you know what you're doing. I'm sorry. I'm not saying the Pistons have to make the playoffs. I'm not even saying they have to make the play-in. I'm saying they have to be competitive. They need to be playing games at the end of March, early April, at the end of the season, where you guys are here on the podcast talking to each other about what do the Pistons need to do to make the play-in? Who do they need to beat? What does the rest of their schedule look like? Like, those conversations need to be had. We don't need to be having another season where we're in December already talking about who's going to be the first, second, third pick in the draft and how would they fit 15 months from now. That's not how. Everyone was on board with the rebuild. Everyone knew the rebuild would be painful, but at a certain point, you need to start showing results. It doesn't have to be a 500 season. It doesn't have to be even 40 wins. You just have to be showing me that you're making progress on the court and getting results. I don't want to hear about individual numbers anymore. I don't want to hear about player X. We're 30 games under 500. We lost this game by 25 points, but did you see the dunk that Jay Ivey had? I don't care anymore. The team needs to be showing results. That is my view on it. And I really think that they need to find somebody else to finish the rebuild if Troy Weaver can't find a way to put a competent team on the court. I know that sounds harsh because I support what he's done so far, but this is the year we need to start making the transition to let people know that the team is going somewhere.
So you're in mid-season trade mode. Sounds like you want something to happen that can kind of push this team to like that next stage.
Well, not necessarily. Like I said,
okay.
I think that Troy's hanging at least to me, he's sending the message that he's hanging his hat on the guys that he drafted. And look, you can say that they're very young, and they are. But you know who was really young last year? Oklahoma City was really young. Orlando was really young. If the Pistons have a season like Orlando had last year, I'd be happy. Like that, they were competitive up until the very end. I'm good with that. I think they only won 34 games or whatever. But you know what? They were clearly when you looked at them play, they looked like a team that was good and improving and would be clearly better the next season. That's all I want to see from the Pistons. I don't look if the opportunity comes up to grab somebody that could make an impact, then by all means go for it. But I don't think you should have to mortgage your future or trade Jaden Ivey, which is, I know he's the popular guy that people are talking about trading for a veteran. I don't think they should need to do that. I think if you look, you're the GM, you hung your hat on your ability to draft players. You have no future picks because you traded for current picks. You used your assets on that. You've stocked your roster with your own draft picks. I think that should be enough to at least show that you have a competitive team. And if it's not, then we need to find someone that'll move the team in another direction. Because I don't know that Troy Weaver has shown a propensity yet for being that guy that would trade, a young player for a veteran. I don't think he's wanting to do that. And look, you still have a great trade chip in Bojan. You can move forward without trading a young player. I'm just saying. I don't think this roster is as bad as people think it is. And maybe that's wishful thinking on my part. But I think I have more belief in Isaiah Stewart than I think most people do. I think that he is going to be a very key piece. I think he's the type of player that when he's on a playoff team, everybody immediately sees the value that he brings. I think on a bad team, he kind of looks worse than he is.
No doubt. Yeah, next season will certainly be, I think, in many respects, a pivotal season. Just understanding where this team is in the rebuild. I don't want to say make or break, but I think this season will say a lot. Keith, we'll close out with one last question. Who is a player in franchise history that you feel like isn't discussed enough or maybe isn't known enough by modern Pistons fans?
Oh, God. You got an hour? Well, there's just so many. There's I mentioned this to Bryce years ago on his old podcast, but the Pistons actually had a Hall of Fame backcourt before they were even an NBA team. Bobby McDermott and Buddy Jeanette. Bobby McDermott, for a lot of people, is considered the best basketball player of the first half of the 20th century. And when the Pistons were in the National Basketball League prior to the NBA, they were almost a super team with him. But if you don't want to go back quite that far, and I understand that, we can settle on a guy by the name of I want to say Adrian Dantley, but even though everyone knows Adrian Dantley, but I think people look at him in a negative light because how things ended, and no one really understands how good he was those first 2 years he was in Detroit. I've been over Lanier. DeBusschere would have been my answer prior to the opening of this podcast. There's just so many. A real fun player. Eric Money, guy in the late 1970s, kind of this like Ish Smith type jitterbug. No one has ever heard of him. I found that out by playing that Squares game where like you ask for a former Piston, and 0.1% of the people, and the comments were immediately when I posted the picture, who the heck is Eric Money? Eric Money is a really, really fun player in the late 1970s. Like I said, very much like Ish Smith, a jitterbug, way quicker than anyone else on the court, very good mid-range shooter. I wish there was more I could point to. There is some film on him, but I wish there was more I could point to the casual fan that could look him up, because I think people will have a lot of fun watching him play.
All right, Keith, man, this was amazing. We actually kept it to an hour. You were awesome getting through all of this. This was incredible. We are definitely going to have you back. I think this will become a thing where we'll bring you back. We'll talk about another era or a certain player, a couple certain players. And then next time, hopefully get more of your thoughts on the current team. I know we didn't give you quite as much wiggle room with that. But before we let you go, let everybody know where they can find you, follow you, and definitely listen to the podcast.
My name is Keith Black Trudeau. I co-host with Mike Payton a podcast called Bad Boys and Beyond. We are a NBA history-centric podcast with a focus on the Detroit Pistons, but we try to keep it every other week, going from Pistons-centric episode to a broader NBA history-centric episode. Our redrafts are a lot of fun. We like to bring guests on to participate. But I grew up as a Pistons fan. I've been a Pistons fan for over 35 years now. And I have a Twitter. Well, I guess it's now called X. No, screw that. I'm calling it Twitter. I have a Twitter account, Charlatan, one word, 28 is my handle. I post little videos. I have an extensive basketball library that I like to draw clips from that people maybe hadn't seen, or about players that maybe people don't know about. It's just my avenue to share my love of basketball history with everybody. So those are the two ways you can interact with me more if you want to.
Keith, you've got to be in the top 0.5% of Hoops Grizz players. You flexed me earlier this week, but I posted about 75%. I think you had 99 point something, which was probably low for you. You probably, come on, man. You just next level with that. That was Keith Black Trudeau, Pistons historian. Thank you so much for joining us today. And I'll close this out. Thanks to our audio producer, Robin Chan, our executive producer, Anjanette Delgado, and our sports editor, Kirk Crawford. Also, big shout out to Wes, as always, and we'll talk to you all next week.